They called themselves soldiers of God, but their war was against the very idea of individual freedom. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Corps, or ACMC, wasn't just another fringe religious group. It was a crucible designed to break down, then rebuild, its followers into unthinking instruments of its leader's will. A spiritual boot camp where the drill sergeants were self-proclaimed prophets and the battlefield was the human mind. This wasn't a story of gentle persuasion. It was a narrative of psychological warfare, isolation, and a relentless assault on personal identity. The stakes were nothing less than the souls of its recruits, and the price of failure could be devastating. The ACMC began its journey in the late 1970s, founded by a man named Jim Green. He wasn't a charismatic preacher in the traditional sense, but rather a figure who cultivated an image of stark authority, a stern patriarch leading his flock into spiritual battle. Green's vision was radical, a global army of Christian missionaries trained to aggressively confront what he saw as the evils of the modern world. They would live communally, surrender all possessions, and dedicate every waking moment to the core. He preached a doctrine of extreme literalism, a fire and brimstone interpretation of Scripture that justified absolute obedience and fervent activism. Members were taught that the outside world was corrupt, a place of temptation and sin, from which they needed to be protected. The Corps established its primary compound in rural Arizona, a sprawling, isolated property that served as both a home and a training ground. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy to sever ties with past lives and reinforce dependence on the group. New recruits, often young and impressionable, were immediately immersed in a demanding routine. Days began before dawn, filled with prayer, scripture study, and intense physical labor. Sleep was minimal, food was basic, and personal time was almost non-existent. This regimen, while framed as spiritual discipline, served another purpose: to systematically erode individual will. Exhaustion makes people vulnerable, open to suggestion, and less likely to question authority. It was a classic technique of coercive persuasion. Former members describe a constant atmosphere of fear and control. Every action, every thought was scrutinized. Disobedience, or even questioning, could lead to public shaming, ostracization, or harsh physical punishments. Children born into the ACMC, or brought in by their parents, faced an even more profound challenge. They knew no other life, no other reality. Their education was entirely controlled by the Corps, their worldview shaped solely by Jim Green's teachings. One account details a young girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, being forced to memorize lengthy scriptures, her small hand trembling as she recited passages about divine wrath. This wasn't learning, it was indoctrination. The Corps engaged in aggressive street preaching, often confronting people directly, attempting to convert them with forceful rhetoric. This public display of zeal further cemented their identity as outsiders, separate from mainstream society. Financially, the ACMC operated on the principle of total tithing, meaning members surrendered all their assets to the group. This ensured complete financial dependence, making it incredibly difficult for anyone to leave, even if they wanted to. Jim Green, the leader, held absolute power. His word was law, his interpretations of the Bible unquestionable. He was not just a pastor, he was a prophet, a general, a judge, and in the eyes of his followers, a direct conduit to God himself. But beneath the surface of unwavering faith and aggressive evangelism, stories of abuse and manipulation began to emerge. Former members, those who managed to escape, painted a grim picture of life within the Corps. Accounts spoke of psychological torment, emotional manipulation, and even physical violence disguised as discipline. The line between spiritual guidance and outright abuse blurred until it disappeared entirely. The outside world, particularly law enforcement and cult awareness groups, started to take notice. Concerns mounted about the welfare of children within the compound and the coercive tactics used to retain adult members. The pressure on the ACMC intensified in the 1990s. Media reports highlighted the extreme nature of the group, bringing their controversial practices into the public eye. This unwelcome scrutiny began to chip away at their isolation. Families of members, desperate to reconnect, organized interventions and sought legal avenues to free their loved ones. They faced an uphill battle, often met with resistance from both the Corps and the deeply indoctrinated individuals inside. The long-term psychological impact on those who left the ACMC was profound. Many struggled with PTSD, identity crises, and a deep distrust of authority and organized religion. Rebuilding a life outside the core was a monumental task. Jim Green eventually faced legal challenges, including accusations of child abuse and other offenses. While details are complex and varied across different reports, the legal battles further exposed the inner workings of his controversial organization. The aggressive Christianity Missionary Corps, while still active in some form, is a shadow of its former self. Its story serves as a stark reminder of the dangers inherent when absolute power is granted to a single individual, especially under the guise of spiritual purity. It underscores how easily faith can be twisted into a tool of control, and how the promise of salvation can become a cage. Next,